It's 1783, and you're a chicken in France. Though you and the animal to your right are familiar with flying, you're moments away from soaring higher than ever before. And also, there's a sheep. Though this may sound frightening, it's actually the luckiest day of your life. Had you not been caged and tied to the first aircraft in human history, you likely would have been sold for about 12 cents in the Versailles market. But why were you selected? Well, humans, while daring and inventive, are uncertain at how an altitude as high as 1,800 feet would affect their bodies. Their species had scaled mountains taller than this, but never before had a person reached these heights so quickly. And the two brothers in charge of this invention wanted to cover all their bases through thorough testing. The sheep was the most similar animal to a human they could easily acquire and risk the life of, making her the primary test subject. The duck was actually familiar with soaring high above town, but what if the heat or smoke from the hot air balloon became too much? In other words, he's the control subject. And then there's you. I don't know why you're here, actually, because you can't fly more than 10 feet and you aren't anything like a human. You were kind of just added on as a curiosity. I mean, a bird that can't really fly. But what if he can? Honestly, I think you're kind of just the third wheel here. But the Montgolfier brothers, the king and queen consort of France, 130,000 onlookers, and you, yourself, are about to find out at any moment. The stitched paper and silk balloon is spread out flat on the ground, and after being inspected for any new tears or weak points, the combination of straw and wool was ignited in a large brazier suspended beneath the mountain of fabric. Ensuring the hot air could rise without setting the balloon itself on fire was arguably one of the most important steps, but nothing the brothers hadn't practiced before. Unmanned flights where the hot air balloon was tethered to the ground had been tested many times, and the first untethered flight was successful 3 months before today. You and your new friends lift from the ground, and the humans release your support ropes. You are flying freely, but still caged. While the humans selected a very docile sheep species, she unfortunately panics midair and begins to kick. Though the flight so far has been a success, she strikes you in the leg, which is left in agonizing pain for the rest of the flight. As you float towards a field 2 miles away, landing safely and awaiting to be rescued and inspected by the creators of this demonstration. You're carried away from the now deflated balloon back to the castle, where you meet the king himself. They confirm you've suffered a broken leg from the anxious sheep, but the good news is the altitude seems to have had no effect on any of the passengers. And your luck only continues, because while the duck was released after the demonstration, you and the sheep have been rewarded a life of luxury in the royal menagerie, to live out the rest of your days, being greeted by countless visitors after successfully flying the world's first aircraft. A few months later, the first manned balloon takes flight. Though once again it's tethered to the ground like previous tests, the first untethered manned flight takes place in November of 1783. Initially, the king decreed that criminals would be the first pilots, but Jean-Francois Pilatre de Rosière, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's the scientist who had been in the tethered balloon the month before, and so it was official. Aviation was born, and though it's still rare, balloons became an increasingly common spectacle of cutting-edge technology for spectators across Europe to enjoy. It's May 10th, 1785, less than 2 years later, and two historical events were about to occur in the span of a single week. Aeronauts had become more prevalent. That's right, flying was now popular enough that hot air balloon builders and pilots were given their own title. Inspired by flights happening around Europe, A few locals in the small market town of Tullamore in Ireland prepared one of their own. It's the day of the fair, and early that afternoon, when the most civilians were enjoying festivities, an unmanned balloon was launched. Unlike the 43-foot wide balloon launched with farm animals a few years before, this one was just 13 feet wide and held a measly 10% of the hot air in comparison to the larger balloon. Being this small, all it carried was the fuel itself, which was a mix of straw and wool, just like the Montgolfier brothers had used. But shortly after takeoff, actually immediately after takeoff, the balloon burst into flames. The highly flammable cloth quickly turned into a fireball and collided with the rooftop of a home. As quickly as the fire engulfed the balloon, the dry thatch roof completely lit up. The entire town of Tullamore was highly flammable, and onlookers were completely helpless, as that first building, and then the second, and the third, and eventually a dozen buildings were up in flames. Everyone is evacuated, which is luckily made easier by the fact this disaster happened during the day, while much of the town's people were already out and about. 30, 40, 50 houses are on fire, and by the time everyone's dispersed, over 100 homes are burning. This hot air balloon destroyed the entirety of Tullamore. The flames eventually died down and revealed just 5 surviving buildings, covered in ash among the smoldering debris. They lost everything, and they did not have home insurance. In less than a day, the entire town was displaced, but the first aviation disaster in human history resulted in 0 casualties. It was genuinely miraculous that nothing more than physical possessions and structures were grieved, as well as some livestock from the local farmers and sellers who were not as lucky as our squad of animals from the previous balloon flight. Absorbing this loss and having to rebuild permanently affected their lives. Nobody was held liable or accountable for this disaster. There weren't exactly laws surrounding aviation at the time, and exactly who was responsible for launching this balloon remains a mystery. It's May 15th, 1785. That's 5 days after Ireland's town was annihilated, and we find ourselves back in France. The ballooning pioneer, Jean-Francois, as mentioned before, had successfully petitioned the King of France to be the first man to fly in a tethered hot air balloon after the king suggested they use criminals as the first human test subjects, and he was ready to fly once again. But this time, his ambition would lead him across the English Channel. He designed a new balloon, and you could call it the first hybrid vehicle because it combined a hydrogen gas cell to lift it, but a hot air chamber to control its altitude. A man named Pierre joined him as they launched from the French shore in hopes to reach England. Takeoff, while the most nerve-wracking step, was successful, but then the balloon exploded. The hot air flame ignited the hydrogen on board, and while the crowd wasn't as large as the initial flight with the chicken, ballooning was the equivalent to a 17th century rocket launch, so people always loved to attend. Eyewitnesses described the balloon as having taken off just fine, and everything looked like any other flight, until it suddenly exploded and spiraled to the ground. It landed in a field, which is a step up from on top of a highly flammable rooftop, which, by the way, the town of Tullamore rebuilt their homes with less flammable materials the second go-around. But just 5 days after that first aviation disaster, shocked onlookers watched 2 Frenchmen's bodies burn underneath the smoldering cloth. Previous manned balloons flew as low as 350 feet, but these 2 aeronauts had achieved over 1,000 feet of elevation before this explosion. The outskirts of the city became scattered and burnt pieces of cloth. 2 bodies were collected from the field, and history had been written once again as the first ever aviation disaster and first ever aviation fatalities happened in a span of just 5 days. Though this second disaster encouraged innovators to become more careful when experimenting with hydrogen, luckily they were unperturbed from slowing down progress as engineers around the world continued to create flying machines, though fewer chickens were utilized from this point forward.